What we do know is that when emissions increase, it increases various types of climate risk. So when we are increasing emissions, when we are contributing to the increase in emissions, we are engaging activities that impose risk on climate vulnerable people. And typically, when you are imposing risk on someone, this calls for justification. Now, sometimes you may have a justification. There are many things that we do all the time that can be risk imposing, but we think we could provide a justification. And even with respect to emissions, it may be that certain actors may emit without matching their emissions with corresponding removals, but they have a good justification for doing so. So, for example, a very poor country may have a good reason not to be matching its emissions with emissions removals. Nevertheless, you do need a justification. So, absent some justification, when you are imposing risk by increasing emissions, you have to justify your risk imposition. And if you don't have a good justification, you can be acting wrongly. Now, I take it that net zero declarations are taking seriously this idea that we are contributing to climate risk. And the net zero idea is connected to the idea that if we match our emissions with corresponding removals, we can reach a state where we can say to climate vulnerable people that we're not actually imposing risk on them. Why? Because although we do engage in some activities which emit, it's not true that our overall impact on the environment is such that we are increasing the risks that they face. So I take it that that's the sort of implicit idea in net zero declarations. And my question today is about this issue of, well, when I'm thinking about whether or not I can say that I'm living a net zero lifestyle, or when a country can say that it's operating in a net zero way, what emissions that get released into the atmosphere should count as their emissions? Now, there's a second question, which is what should count as bona fide removals? And there are lots of interesting questions about offsets and to what extent different actors should be able to rely on offsets to meet net zero targets as opposed to merely making cuts in their emissions. But I'm not today going to be talking about the issue of offsets, merely about the questions of if we're trying to do this kind of accounting, what kind of emissions should we put on our ledger that are candidates for being offset? Okay, so the question then is, when a country makes a net zero declaration, how should its emissions accounting be done? Which emissions should it put on its ledger? So I'm going to talk a little bit about interpreting the claim. Then I'm going to talk about various different options for answering that question. And I'm going to say what I think is problematic about these options. And then I'm going to provide a proposed answer, and then discuss a few issues that arise from this answer. So if I'm correct, then net zero targets are commitments to making no net addition by a certain date to the global atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. Now, the global context is such that in recent international reports, it's been claimed that limiting warming to 1.5 Celsius implies reaching net zero carbon emissions globally by around 2050. So the idea is that this global goal of trying to limit temperature increases will require that we reach this net zero as a global matter by that date. Now, when a country is making a net zero declaration, it seems to be making three different claims that I think should be distinguished. And I'll give you an illustration of one. For example, the United Kingdom in its recent net zero document said, "We are proud to lead the world in ending our contribution to climate change." And when they're saying that, they're saying that their net zero target is supposed to be a good indicator of whether or not they have ended their contribution to climate change by increasing global emissions. Second, there's claims about making no contribution to increasing GHG concentrations. There are various different ways you might be increasing GHG concentrations without them being your own contribution in some direct way. And then third, there are people, they're making claims about our all reaching global net zero. So the idea that your net zero target is supposed to say something about what you're doing and also about how you're relating to others in the service of achieving this global goal. Now, since, as I've put it, climate change is an ethical problem, and net zero declarations are thereby implicitly ethical claims, that is, that they're claims that you are being kind of a good climate citizen, then the should in our question is an ethical should. That is, how ethically should countries be counting their emissions for the purposes of net zero accounting? So just to go back, increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases burden the climate vulnerable. This, as a result, means that they can demand a justification for the imposition of that burden. And note that there are other ways that we might burden the climate vulnerable, and there are additional ways in which we might fail to prevent that burden. So attaining net zero is neither necessary nor sufficient to show that you're somehow culpable with respect to climate change. But what we want to look at is what kind of accounting system is needed to vindicate two implicit ethical claims that we think actors are making when they're making net zero declarations. Namely, the first, that they will be reducing to zero their contribution to increasing these concentrations. And number two, that in doing so, they'll be contributing to the collective goal of reaching global net zero. Okay, so what are the options? What are the different ways in which an actor might be counting its emissions? Well, the prevailing model, this is one that is typically used and which features in actual net zero declarations, is often referred to as production-based accounting. And the basic idea is that the emissions that you count as yours, if you're a country, for example, are those which are produced in the territory that is under your jurisdiction. So if petrol gets burned in a car in Beirut, then it goes on Lebanon's ledger. But no release of greenhouse gases that doesn't take place within Lebanon's jurisdiction counts on its ledger. Now, there's some advantages, I think, to this kind of accounting. One is that it seems direct, that it seems to be targeting the actions that most directly add to GHG concentrations. A second advantage is that it's complete in the sense that if every country did reach net zero in its production-based emissions, the global goal would be reached. If it's true that on every territory of every state in the world that their emissions net to zero, then it's true that we would reach this global goal, because globally it would also be the case that no additions would be made to global greenhouse gas concentrations. And a third advantage is that it's feasible, and we know that it's feasible because it's actual. It's the system that's most actually often adopted nowadays. So what are some of the worries that one might have about this? Well, let's again clarify that this production-based accounting means that the emissions that get entered on some country's ledger are those that are produced in the territory that is under its jurisdiction. We'll just call that country X. So one objection is that it allows X's emissions to go down, even though it doesn't seem to be contributing to the global goal. Now, how might this happen? Well, one way it might happen is if X stops producing emissions. For example, say at one point in time, they produce widgets. And instead of producing widgets, which have corresponding emissions, they stop producing them. But local consumption of widgets doesn't change in any way. And as a result, they import widgets from some other country. And let's just suppose that that other country is a little bit less efficient in the way in which they make widgets, such that there's actually more emissions resulting from the production of widgets in the other country from which it now imports than when they were producing widgets on their own. Now, economists refer to this kind of phenomenon as carbon leakage. And the basic idea is that this is a way in which one country, by reducing its own emissions, is sort of just displacing, and in the example that I'm giving, actually contributing to an increase of global emissions, even while it is producing fewer emissions. And this is not just an academic worry, in that it actually seems to be true of many European countries that the amount of emissions that they are actually directly releasing into the atmosphere has been decreasing, but in many cases there has been no decrease in the amount of emissions if you look at them from the consumption perspective. So the amount of emissions that were required to produce the goods and services that are being consumed in the UK is not diminishing. In fact, it's increasing, even though the UK's own production of emissions has been decreasing. So again, this objection seems to be targeting what we take to be sort of implicit in these claims, namely that an actor, in saying that if they have achieved net zero, that they will be organizing their economy in a way that's making no net contribution to global warming. And it doesn't seem quite plausible that a country which in no way is altering its consumption and is sending all sorts of price signals, that is incentivizing the production of emissions, can say that the organization of its economy is not making a significant contribution to climate change, even if it's not releasing these emissions into the atmosphere on its territory. Another example is if, say, a country X, and this is one that hits home in Australia, if a country sells fossil fuels that are burned elsewhere, it seems that the country has contributed to the resulting emissions in some very significant way. So even if the Norwegians and the Australians are producing fewer emissions, and even if they are consuming goods that require fewer emissions, it seems rather strange for them to position themselves as good climate citizens if they are stably resourcing emissions that are being released by others. So both of these objections point to ways in which the organization of a country's economy can make rather substantial contributions to concentrations of greenhouse gases without necessarily releasing those gases within its own territory. Okay, so let's think about what other options there might be if we find those kind of worries compelling. Well, one alternative that suggests itself is often referred to as extraction-based accounting. And here the idea would be that the emissions that get entered on a country's ledger are those that are produced from fossil fuels that are extracted on the territory which is under its jurisdiction. So this would certainly close a loophole that I noted that existed in the production-based accounting. So Australia would have to put on its ledgers the emissions that would be released into the atmosphere from the coal that it extracts and sells to China. And the Norwegians would have to put on their ledger the emissions that are created by the oil that they sell to other countries. There are also advantages of this kind of system in that it seems to reduce informational burdens, and that there's actually relatively few places where fossil fuels are extracted compared to all the many places in which things that have been created through the use of fossil fuels are consumed. And in this case, you could also, if you extend it to all greenhouse gas sources, it would be a system that would be complete, and it would be directly targeting the physical source of the global problem. That is, we have the problem that we have because of the extraction of these fossil fuels and their subsequent burning. So these all seem to be advantages of this kind of extractive-based accounting system. But I think here too, there are some problems. for example, a country could be claiming to be reducing its emissions without, in fact, contributing to reaching a global goal. So one example of how this might work is a country that is ceasing or limiting its extraction of fossil fuels, but is nevertheless burning lots of fossil fuels that it's importing from elsewhere. Or if that same country is adding significantly to market demand for emissions-intensive goods. In these ways, a country would be contributing substantially through the organization of its economy to increasing emissions, even though if you simply look at their extraction-based accounting profile, they would be reducing their emissions significantly. So this, again, naturally suggests a third option, which is consumption-based accounting. And the idea here would be that whether or not emissions count on a country's ledger depends on where the goods and services in which where the goods are consumed. So the idea would be that if you create some electric drill or you create some foodstuff through the use that involves use of fossil fuel miles, the emissions would go on the ledger where those goods are actually received and used. Now, again, this example too seems to close a loophole with the kinds of accounting systems that we've mentioned before. Namely, before, one of the examples I gave was a country which is reducing its release of greenhouse gases through its production activities, while simultaneously incentivizing the increase in the release of emissions through its consuming behavior. But of course, this sort of system would pick up on precisely that. So even if the UK stops creating widgets, if it's consuming widgets that are created elsewhere, it nevertheless would have to count those emissions on its ledger. Good. But there are problems. You could probably fill in the blanks from what I've said before with this kind of system of accounting. Here too, you could have a case where a country is reducing its emissions according to this way of accounting for emissions, while nevertheless not contributing to reaching the global goal. For example, it could be reducing its consumption, but simultaneously more increasing its production or its sale of resources that are then being burned elsewhere. So this kind of accounting would miss the way in which a country's export-oriented production emissions can be contributing to increases in global greenhouse gas concentrations. Okay, so I've mentioned some of the contenders and what I take to be some of the problems with them. Another thing that I might just proposal I might just mention in passing is the idea of, well, maybe we should have a more heavily moralized notion of which emissions get on which country's ledger, so that we say we put emissions on a country's ledger if they are in some way at fault for those emissions being released. Now, I think this is there are interesting questions about who should bear moral responsibility for any particular emissions. But this is not really a way of doing what net zero declarations are trying to do. For example, it could have the result that a country which faultlessly emitted quite a bit would count as net zero. And that just seems a rather strange way of talking about it. It seems more plausible to say, no, this is a country that is not net zero. It is actually increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases. Nevertheless, it has a good justification for doing so. So it's not really a way of answering our question and linking up with existing net zero discourse. It's kind of changing the subject quite significantly. So the proposal that we're currently drawn to is what I'm going to refer to as value chain accounting. So the idea of this accounting system is that it has two features. The first feature is that a country's net emissions only count as going down when it is actually contributing to reaching the global goal. And the second feature is that it captures the relationships, and I've mentioned a plurality of relationships, through which that country, as an economic agent, can contribute to greenhouse gas concentrations. So that means that we'll need to include production and extraction and consumption emissions. So this would mean allocating to a country not only emissions that it directly produces, but also additional downstream emissions that it relies on in order to realize the value of the products that it sells and exports, and also the additional upstream emissions that are embedded in the products that it buys as imports. So an example, if Australia sells its coal to China, where it's burned to produce solar panels, and the solar panels are bought in New Zealand. The proposal is that the emissions here should be allocated to all three countries. Now, I've mentioned that there are this plurality of ways in which a country could be adding emissions to its ledger. But I also think that we need to countenance a variety of ways in which a country could be balancing removals against emissions. So the proposal is that if emissions are matched by removals of emissions at any point in the value chain, then the removal should be allocated to all countries in the value chain. So, for example, I mentioned in this case of Australia selling its coal to China, where it's burned to produce solar panels, and they're bought in New Zealand. Now, suppose that Australia is committed to, and this is far from the truth, suppose Australia were committed to buying offsets that match all of the carbon that would be released through the burning of the coal that it sells to China. If that's true, then I think China, not only would Australia be credibly able to be claiming to be net zero within this in this domain, because it's matching its extraction-based emissions with removals, but also the Chinese, when they buy the coal from Australia and burn it, would not actually have to count any additional emissions on their ledger, because it's already the case that the burning of these fuels is creating only that amount of emissions, which Australia has already been committed to offsetting. And correspondingly, when they're bought in New Zealand, here too, the New Zealanders can claim to be operating in a net zero fashion, because they're not, through their purchasing behavior, in any way increasing global emissions, because of this commitment, improbable as it is in my fanciful example, that the Australians have already credibly committed to offsetting them. So if that's right, then when we're doing emissions accounting in this way, we construct a country's ledger in a way that has sort of two levels. At the first level, a country records its production emissions, that is, the emissions that it actually is releasing into the atmosphere, and alongside with any matching removals. So if a country is creating widgets and this requires them to burn fuel to power the factory that's creating these widgets, those emissions that result from that go on its ledger. And of course, if it's had any matching removals, say it is makes some credible offset, say by paying for forests to be planted in some adequate way, or when more technologies that allow for carbon storage to come on, that it invests in those. So on that level, it puts on the ledger both its additions and its subtractions in the form of offsets on that ledger. Then at level 2, it takes seriously the production's emissions and removals that are either upstream or downstream in its value chain. So if it's even once it has matched its own production emissions with removals, it can't credibly claim to be net zero unless it looks upstream to the production emissions of all those that furnish it with goods and services that it consumes, and also downstream at whether or not all the emissions that flow from things it sells to others and whether they are being offset, whether by themselves or by others in the value chain. So this one natural question that this raises is just how far along the value chain should you go? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples just to indicate the way in which I think we should try to fill this in. So in one example, say that New Zealand is buying solar panels from China. The factories that produce them are powered by green hydrogen, a clean energy, which doesn't result in any emissions. But the factory workers eat food that have high food miles. That is, they eat food that only came to market as a result of lots of activities which added a lot of emissions. Or second example, Australia sells green hydrogen to China, where it powers the production of solar panels. The panels are then bought in New Zealand, where some of the installers drive big SUVs, combustion engine vehicles that create emissions. So we need a question about which of the upstream emissions get counted and which of the downstream emissions get counted in these types of cases. So the upstream criterion is what emissions that are released in producing and supplying a product to an ongoing market from which you buy get included on your ledger. And the downstream criterion asks what emissions that are released in the use of the product that you produce for sale, where the economic value of the product relies on that use. So the way in which it would apply to these cases is that if New Zealand buys solar panels from China, and the factories that produce them are powered by green hydrogen, and the factory workers eat food with high food miles, we want to say that New Zealand is exerting a market demand for the factory production, but not for the food miles. So it would count on its ledger what it is sort of directly calling for, as it were, when it makes a demand for the production of these things, but not ancillary emissions that happen to result that are in some way causally upstream from these goods and services that it's buying. That is, sort of in calling for the solar panels, you are implicitly calling for what goes into making and transporting the panels, but you're not calling for various other emissions that people who are in some way involved in making these and transporting these panels may be making. In the other example of where I gave of Australia selling green hydrogen to China, wouldn't it be wonderful if that's what they were selling to China? And where it powers the production of solar panels that are bought in New Zealand, the economic value of Australia's product is realized in using it to power the factory, but not the vehicles that the installers drive to put these panels in. So our claim is that these criteria are sufficient for attributing emissions to some actor that lie either upstream or downstream in its value chain. There may be others, but they would require some further explanation. Okay, so I want to close by raising a few issues about this sort of proposal, because I think it will sort of clarify the nature of the proposal and try to give a few answers. So one issue one might have about this sort of proposal, which expands quite considerably the range of emissions that we think a country should be putting on its ledger for the purposes of net zero accounting, is, well, look, the world isn't going to adopt this sort of accounting system, so what's even the point of proposing it? And the answer is that, well, look, we're not saying that people will adopt this proposal. We're simply saying this is the kind of accounting system that you would need if you were actually to be able to credibly make the kind of commitments that people claim to be making when they make net zero declarations. So our claim is not that people should adopt this or that they have adopted it or that there's any chance that they would adopt it. It's rather that if you're going to make certain claims about what your achieving net zero represents, then you had better be creating the ledgers that count your emissions rather differently than the way in which they're currently counted. Another worry is that the proposal, as I mentioned it, indicates that the very same emissions can count on the ledgers of different countries. And you might be worried that this double counts both emissions and removals. But the response to this is that this actually accurately reflects responsibility for emissions. So when both the buyer and when both the seller and a user of some product will impose some burden on a third party, then both of them can be responsible for it. So we think that's actually a virtue rather than a vice of the proposal. Now, it might also seem that there's something worrisome about the double counting of removals. So if in the fanciful case I gave, that if the Australians are offsetting all the emissions that will result from the burning of their coal, and the coal is then burned in China, then the Chinese won't have to count the burning of coal and release of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere on their ledger because of the offset that the Australians have done. But we think this is plausible because it's plausible because if the point of net zero declarations is supposed to be making a claim about whether or not you're running your economy in a climate neutral way, well, in that case, both the Chinese and the Australians could claim to be operating their economy in a net zero way. They are acting in a climate neutral way. Now, of course, if all the costs of removing greenhouse gases fall on one country, we might say that there's something unfair about the system. That's fair enough, but that doesn't mean that they can't credibly claim that they're actually not imposing risk by the way in which they're organizing their economy. Okay. Another worry you might have is about informational burdens. So if you actually try to get information about the value chain emissions of this sort, it's not available, and it would just be too burdensome to collect. Well, one reply is that this is not really an objection to what we've said, but to those who are making these claims. If it's not possible to be able to supply the kind of information that would be needed to underlie these claims, well, the problem is with the claims that are being made. A second thing is that even though the information is not perfect, countries do collect information of the sorts that would be relevant to making these kinds of claims about contributions of the various sorts. And since what we're interested in is whether countries can justify the way in which they're increasing expectations of harm as a result of their actions, sometimes we can use averages to fill in information gaps. So we don't know exactly how much carbon was involved in some product that is consumed in Lebanon, but we have rough ideas at least of what the characteristic carbon content of some goods are. And we may be able to fill in information gaps about the precise carbon content of any particular good by using average in this way. So it may be that the informational burden is not so extreme as it might be thought. And insofar as there is a problem of the informational burden, this calls for a scaling back of the claims. It doesn't undermine that we've provided the correct account of what you would need if you were to justify these claims. Another worry you might have is that this sort of system would create incentives to let others in the value chain make emissions removals rather than doing them yourself, right? So in the example that I gave, if the Australians are offsetting uh, all of the emissions associated with the burning of the coal that they extract and sell to China, and if the Chinese can then claim these removals, isn't this somehow unfair? It's creating incentives. The answer to this is, well, this might be a problem in the context of enforced compliance, but voluntary participants would have an incentive to seek out low net emissions trade partners. So we actually think it's a good making feature if the incentives of the scheme would be that you want to start to associate with those other actors who are making credible commitments to offsetting their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. So we think that if people were to start to adopt this scheme, it would cause them to sort of seek out other low emissions actors, or insofar as certain actors were bearing the full cost of offsetting emissions associated, say, with raw materials that they sell to others, we think that this could naturally be reflected in prices that they pass on to those whom they are selling the goods to. So there might be ways, even if the initial incidence of the cost would fall on one actor, it would be spread through the system um, in the context of a market. Okay, another worry you might have is about unattainability. So the idea would be, well, maybe something useful is being achieved right now by the pressure to make net zero declarations. 5 years ago, nobody was saying anything about net zero. People were talking simply about emissions reductions. Maybe there's something really lovely and magical about the idea of net zero pledges, partly because it seems to be a satisfiable demand. And our view may seem to imply that it's very difficult for any net zero pledge to be met, given the structure of the world economy. So you might think, well, isn't that rather unhelpful? And the answer I would give is that, well, we can first ask whether countries are actually attaining net zero in their production emissions at present. And then we can ask the second question about whether or not they're achieving these reductions has value. And we think whether or not it actually has value can only be assessed by looking at the other levels, namely by looking at their upstream and downstream emissions. And a second answer is that, look, if net zero declarations are to be both justifiable and attainable, then the claims associated with them need to be scaled back. So maybe what we need to do is adjust net zero discourse to make it clear that what actors are actually claiming when they're claiming to be net zero is something that falls short of the idea that they are actually organizing their economies in ways that are conducive to reaching this global goal. Okay, so the conclusion is just that when a country makes a net zero declaration, it's implicitly undertaking, again, to no longer be contributing to increasing global greenhouse gas concentrations and to be contributing to the overall goal of a global net zero. And I've tried to suggest that to sustain those claims would require that we orient our net zero accounting systems to this value chain accounting system, which takes account of a plurality of ways in which the organization of a country's economy can actually drive increased emissions. I know that was quite a bit of material. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Christian, for this interesting talk and for the kind of puzzle which you propose a solution for. Let's see what people have to say, whether they think there is a problem and whether they think the solution is a good one. The floor is open now. Please raise your hands, and you can unmute yourself as well, but please raise your hands to keep track uh, of the sequence. Anybody wants to?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay, Muhannad, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. And some of my students are here. So we were just talking about net zero yesterday, environmental ethics. And I made some jokes about net zero that hopefully they've seen. Okay, so I have a very
Can you tell me the joke? Can you tell me one of the jokes?
well, I said it was a little bit like saying that, if we carpool and the car ride is long enough for 2 cigarettes, and I tell you, okay, I'll just smoke one now, and I won't smoke the other one. I'm cutting down, and then maybe I can do something like clean your car or whatever. But in the and remove the smell of the cigarette, but the harm is done. You're getting secondhand smoke, which brings me to the central point: is that it seems like all the talk about net zero misunderstands carbon, because carbon's not like I put 3 eggs in the box and then I'll take one out before I put one in. Carbon behaves very differently, and you can't really take back the same carbon. And we're already at a situation where there's too much of it there. So just staying at the current level is problematic. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about these ideas.
Yeah.
And then the other question I had was just about why are you? I mean, it makes sense that we look at nations and their contributions, but how would you be able to apply this to corporations or even militaries or military corporations? Because they are the biggest emitters. Like that, and everything else pales in comparison to military and corporate emissions. But those are the two questions I had.
Good, thanks. So let me start with the first one. So you're completely right that when we emit and we release carbon into the atmosphere, there's no way, whatever we do, to guarantee that we'll extract the exact same carbon molecules from the atmosphere that we put in. In fact, we're almost certainly will not. So let's just imagine one could have doubts about how efficacious carbon capture technology is. But suppose, again, that we were able to sort of turn on an extractor that sort of extracted a certain amount of carbon from the atmosphere. But we had no way of ensuring that it extracted precisely those molecules that we put in.
Well, sorry,
Yeah.
can I just? It's not really about capturing the same one. That would be pointless.
Okay.
What I mean is that once the carbon is out, it harms. So it's like I smoke a cigarette in your car and then I put an air freshener in there, or I clean it for you.
Yeah.
The
That's
cigarette smoke has harmed you.
Yeah, if that's the question, right? So it's not obvious that particular carbon molecules cause harm in some immediate way that is then matched with some corresponding benefit. Rather, it's the amount of the concentration over a long period of time and the risks that it imposes. So if in a relatively short time horizon, you had two acts put together, one of which would have on its own moved the amount of carbon in the atmosphere up, and the other on its own, which have reduced the amount of carbon. If you actually say did those two things simultaneously, you would not actually be in any way increasing the risks faced by people who are climate vulnerable. That's the basic idea. That seems to be the underlying idea behind by which you could say that offsetting is not a way of harming some and benefiting others, but rather behaving in a way that's risk neutral. In fact, I think people who defend offsetting may even allow that, given the chaotic nature of the world, it may turn out that the particular emissions that we emit at any particular time may actually be causally involved in some harm that happens to other people. But I take it that they think that risk is relative to our epistemic state, and we have no real way of knowing. There are lots of things that we do in our behavior all the time, which can make a difference to who gets harmed and who isn't. So we go for a drive. The fact that we're on the road makes a slight difference to traffic patterns, which, 2 years later may result in one person dying in a traffic accident, and another person who would have died in a traffic accident not being died in a traffic accident. So we may make a causal difference through what we do, but what makes it okay, if it's okay, is that our just driving normally doesn't add to aggregate risk in some significant way. So I take it that that's what people are trying to get at when they're trying to justify being net zero in a way that involves both emitting and also removing emissions. The second question was about why focus on countries. And yeah, so I don't, one thing you said was companies are the big emitters. But in a way, yeah, it's certainly true that companies, if you think about their activities, are connected to certain emissions. It can also be true, depending on your system of accounting, that those count as a country's emissions. So if you had a number of different, yeah.
What
So
if
if you had a
you're,
number,
if you're responsible for oil drilling in Antarctica or in the North Pole, but you're, a British or an American company or a Norwegian company, that's not your land. How do you,
yeah,
that's the kind of thing I'm interested in, because in
yeah,
that case, or like Apple is outsourcing production of iPhones, so they don't make them in California.
yeah.
Those, yeah, that's the kind of thing I was worried about.
Yeah, so that concerns me too, right? So what's concerning about those sorts of cases is that, Apple would be owned and registered in the United States. Um, if if Apple only counted on its emissions ledger, those emissions that it actually releases into the atmosphere, within its organization, that might undercount significantly the ways in which it's actually contributing substantially to increases in emissions. So the same kind of reasoning that I've applied to countries, you could apply to companies or to individuals. So if an individual is trying to think about, well, am I living a net zero life? Then I would say, well, if you want to know whether or not you're living a net zero life, you don't simply look at the amount of emissions that you create by driving your car, but you would actually also look to the degree to which you're actually resourcing others in their creation of emissions, or you're consuming things that are incentivizing others to create emissions. So the same, I think, whatever unit you're focusing on, the same kind of logic would apply. I mean, there's another question about, well, what unit should we be focusing on? And I think, like, I mean, in a way, it would be desirable if the whole global economy was simply set up so that it was net zero and it unburdened all these actors about, right? If we just had, like, you know, some sort of universal system that sort of guaranteed that any emissions were matched by removals, in a way, it wouldn't really matter very much. But it matters very much because we don't have that. We don't have a treaty with a first best system. So we're all trying to make things up as we go along. I mean, this is quite interesting in the case of agents like universities. And it's not obvious to me that it's desirable that each and every university be trying to become net zero. It may just be that really what we would want is countries to be net zero, and them to organize their own affairs so that it allowed certain areas perhaps not to be net zero and certain areas to be net zero. It might be that forcing each and every actor to try to be net zero is really inefficient. Maybe maybe universities, to become net zero, they'll have to dramatically cut down on staff travel. And maybe that's really bad for the flourishing of ideas and innovation, right? So those are interesting questions, which I didn't really touch on here, but
Well, thanks. I don't want to take up more time from other people, but thanks for that.
thanks, great questions. Bashar, you've gone very quiet. I think you're muted.
Judy, Yeah, Judy, if your floor is yours, I think you have a hand raised. If you're still,
Yes.
yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Bashar. Christian, thank you very much. Very interesting. I was wondering, sort of along the same lines as Mohanad, and I was thinking about beyond the country level regulation. And so you have, let's just say we are talking about country levels, okay? And we know that not all countries are equal in their structure, in their conditions, in their resources. We have a lot of countries around the world that have poor regulation, environmental regulation, occupational regulation, human resources, human rights, etc. So, and these are places where, these are countries where transnational corporations actually set up their industries to produce different kinds of products for them to be sold globally in the world market, right? So let's just say India, let's just say Southeast Asia, Africa, different parts of the world. So if we're talking about a country level, we're at a disadvantage at the get-go because of the country conditions and probably the interference of the industries in themselves in the country conditions and making sure that the regulations are not. Oh, someone's unmuted. So the idea of the at the country level gets to mind, these countries running in my mind. So what do you say about that?
Yeah.
In addition to that, you also have other global factors such as the World Trade Organization. And how do you infiltrate the World Trade Organization to talk about or to regulate or to think about this kind of zero emission for it to trickle down to the other powerful players in world trade? And what about the arms industries that actually fuel, the word fuel, wars all around the globe? So I think this is, these three things come to mind, just thinking out loud. And these are important things to think about, and it would be great if you can share a couple of thoughts on that. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great. So, so one, you're completely right that different countries are differently situated in terms of their capacities. And so one question is what to make of this. Well, one thing one might say is one worry you might have about the whole net zero idea is that it seems to suggest that it's a goal that all should have. And you might think that no, actually, more appropriately, given the different capacities of different countries, some countries shouldn't really even be necessarily aspiring to be net zero, while others should be aspiring to far exceed net zero so that they're actually net negative. And you might think that things like historical emissions have created a kind of climate debt where particular countries really owe it. Or you might think that it's true that all countries should aspire to be net zero, but there's an open question of how the costs of their becoming net zero ought to be allocated. And we shouldn't assume from the fact that this is a worthwhile goal that it means that countries should be required to do it only on their own resources. So I think those are both important things to consider. But some of the examples you were giving, I think, are really important ones in motivating this sort of proposal, because one of the ideas is that, well, if you have firms which are owned and registered in one country that are effectively, drawing resources from other countries or producing in other countries for the domestic market, that those emissions don't get swept happily under the rug and sort of put offshore in terms of the ledger account. Now there was a time when in sort of the pre-Paris, sort of the Kyoto Agreement, where only certain countries were required to make cuts and other countries were not. At least that was sort of part of this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And in that sort of system, a lot of people were saying, well, this is problematic because the countries that are making cuts are not the countries where a lot of these emissions are actually being produced. So a lot of people said, like, look, if you really want to have a downward effect on emissions, in that Kyoto system, you better shift from production to consumption based. And it's because these were the countries that were primarily countries of consumption that had binding targets, whereas other countries did not. Now that's not so much of an issue. But I guess I would just to sort of sum up, say sort of three things. One is that there's the open question of whether or not it really is a desirable target for each country to try to be net zero. And even if you believe that it is a desirable target, there's a question of how the cost of reaching that target ought to be allocated. And then there's the further question of just about how we determine whether or not a country is net zero and whether or not we simply focus on these territorial based emissions or a broader net. I think the issue about how do you convey these messages into different organizations so that it so that like the system of world trade works with you rather than against you is like really challenging, interesting questions. And at the moment, it's sort of not being in any way addressed through treaty organizations like the WTO. It's simply, well, it's through this sort of emerging practice of pledges and commitments, but it's all rather decentralized. Yeah, and that basically that's just the best that we've got right now. So I guess what I'm trying to do is saying, well, even if given this, even that if it's going to be these voluntary commitments, how should we try to push countries to justify what they're claiming about their voluntary commitments? So we shouldn't make it so that net zero talk is very cheap and the targets are very easy to achieve and sort of hide the ways in which many of the global economies are continuing to resource and fuel these problems. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Any
Thank you.
other questions? If not, I might have one. Let's see what give priority to our audience. Okay, maybe I'll ask anyway, and maybe later people will have. So now, Christian, you have this, observation that this seems to be the net zero accounting based on production in the country or whatever the unit, could be the individual, it could be the country, it could be the company, but let's take the country as an example because it's easier to work with. So it's problematic because of the downstream and upstream also contribution to the gas emissions. So now these upstream and downstream would have to negotiate between them to apportion the responsibility and offset. You have to divide to allocate responsibility for offsetting between them. And is there a method for doing that? And how would, say, Norwegians who sell gas to Germany, how they make the calculation of the offset? How much would go on the Norwegian ledger for that versus the Germans and versus others who are, buying cars from Germany, let's say. So how do you allocate how do you account for that division of?
Yeah. So yeah, really interesting question. So this is not something that so what you're asking is what would be if we think that we should ensure that value chains are carbon neutral, how should the costs of achieving carbon neutrality be spread to different actors among the chain.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one thought is that in a way it may not matter all that much where so if you say that a certain cost attaches to it, say that it to offset the production of widgets that get resourced in one country and sold in another, that all of the emissions associated with that value chain sum to 100 megatons of emissions. So what that means is that, for us to actually be operating in a climate neutral way, we'd have to, somewhere along the line, there'd have to be a purchase of the equivalent amount of offsets, 100 megatons. So which actor? So there are different ways you might think about it. So one way in which you might think about it is that, well, although they all contribute, there's something about a particular way of contributing that puts you more on the hook than some other way. So that, if you're actually releasing the stuff in your territory, that somehow that counts for more, and so you should bear more of the cost. I don't find that way of doing it all that plausible. I think that, these are cases where people are all kind of in it together. Now, insofar as it's these are sort of cost measures, you might think that the different capacities of the different agents would be relevant to whether or not they should foot the bill for this. And that seems plausible to me. They're all contributing through their activities to this surplus of emissions. They may be jointly responsible for reducing it, but how the incidence of the cost should be distributed may depend on the capacities of those in the chain. So nothing I've really said today speaks to that issue, but it's an interesting one. I mean, one way of thinking about it is that if say, even if there is this distinction I mentioned before about sort of initial and final cost bearing. So even if the Norwegians they pay for all the offsets, there's still the question of whether or not the final incidence of that cost falls solely on them, because if they have to purchase offsets for their fuel, it seems pretty unlikely that that's not going to then be reflected in the prices that they demand for their fuel. And so they're going to reap some of the benefits of those higher prices when they sell them to their customers. And in that way, sort of the cost gets spread through the different actors on the chain, even though the initial incidence of the cost bearing is at one point in the chain.
Yeah, would that require enforceability of the zero net? So if it's not enforceable, you might not have incentive to buy higher prices as an incentive. But of course, yeah, if you want to achieve the zero net, that would be the case. You have incentive to buy higher prices if you're already offset by. But then you would think that doesn't matter who pays for the offset, because now when you pay for offset, you can sell your products at a better price. Is that you don't need to apportion the contribution between in the chain, because anybody can pay for the whole thing, and then they will reflect in their prices? Do you think that would resolve the?
Yeah, well, that was sort of my initial. Yeah, of course, it's in a way it is the Norwegians could choose simply not to affect not to let the, to sell it below market price or something like that, or above market price, depending on. So I guess there would be different ways the Norwegians could decide whether or not to pass the cost of the offset on to their customers. Is that sort of the thought?
Yeah.
So if they had if they had some discretion about how much of the cost to pass down the chain, how should they exercise that discretion?
Yeah, and because you might think I'm not working under full compliance with the zero net, and therefore I have to pay my share. and let others decide whether they want to pay their share. Then I can say, I've done my work. So you have to figure out what is your share, assuming that others are not going to do the. So that creates a problem under.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, yeah. So one way in which you might be able to help ensure that people do their share is by charging them for it.
Okay.
Right. But I hadn't really thought about this particular issue before. So you might think like, yeah, so the Norwegians buy all the offsets. But then there's still the question about who they sell their oil to and at what prices. And it might be that, say they're selling their fuel to poorer countries. It seems plausible to me that the Norwegians might think that, well, look, we can much more easily bear the cost of ensuring that this value chain is net zero than some of our downstream customers. And so we have an obligation to do it. That seems plausible enough to me.
Yeah. It does. Sorry, I don't want to. Maybe others might to enter into the discussion. Anybody? Maybe you can then, in this case, continue a bit further. So now, so does it matter whether you're selling your oil to people who want to produce cars versus those who want to produce solar panels? So you have to, in a way, offset less, or
well, it does matter, right? It does matter in the sense that if you're taking seriously your downstream emissions, some of those emissions will be the result of what people use your resources to do. So if they're, if they're buying your fossil fuels to power stations which are creating, very high emissions vehicles, then on our view, that makes a difference to what you're on the hook for in terms of your emissions if you're the Norwegians. And that's important because it also gives them an incentive to try to ensure that where they're selling resources is in some way being responsive to whether or not those resources are going to be used in such a way that are going to increase or not further greenhouse gas concentrations.
Or decrease. In the case of solar panels, I might be upset by the fact that people who buy them would have produced more gas emissions.
Yeah, so well, that's a different kind of offset. Yeah, so that's an interesting. So there's a question about what should count, whether or not that would count as an offset or not. So it's true in one sense that if we create solar panels, this has a positive benefit, namely that people won't use other things, right? But it's not obvious to me that I should then claim as a removal all the emissions that don't get put in as a result of their buying my panels.
Yeah, I mean that's my question. That's if you want to do the chain thing, you would seem to have to include that as part of the.
But that's not a removal.
Overall.
That's not a removal. That's a non-contribution.
Preventing.
Yeah, it's a preventing.
Preventing from.
Yeah, exactly. So let me give you an example to try to make this seem plausible. So suppose there's a lake that I want to go boating on. But the problem is that, my boat has a little bit of a discharge and it raises the level of toxicity in the lake. Well, if I go boating and I run an extractor that takes an equivalent amount of toxins out, I could say that I'm running a toxin neutral way. But suppose that I go boating, but simultaneously pay you not to go boating. Can I claim my prevention of you not going boating as an offset to my boating? That doesn't seem plausible. it seems to me that I'm still answerable for the fact that I actually am putting toxins in there. So this would be a case where
Yeah.
this is also a case where I'm, preventing someone else from doing something, but it doesn't seem obvious that I can claim that the benefit of that prevention as a justification for my own contribution.
Yeah, that raises the question about what kind of counterfactual one would work with
Yeah,
in calculating offsetting.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
and favoring some am I counterfactual? What would have happened had I not done that versus what's my
Yeah,
know,
so that shows no, right? So that example shows no. So if you think that if in that case, even if I pay you not to go boating when you otherwise would have gone boating and I go boating myself, if we think that I'm answerable for the risk that I impose through my boating, then we're not committed to a simple counterfactual account, because in that case, it's true that on net, I don't make a difference to the prospects faced by these people, because had I not gone boating, you would have gone boating and they would have faced the same risk.
Okay, I'm not so sure that I share the intuition here about the
Yeah.
difference between the boating and other kinds of offsetting, since unless you think you shouldn't go boating anyway, and you should,
No, and I'm
produce.
saying that if the concern is that, like, what raises a question about the boating is that by boating you put toxins in which increase the risk faced by people. That's the example. And so then the question is, what can I say to justify my behavior such that they no longer have any sort of complaint against me? And it's not
But if you
obvious that
think,
in the case where when I prevent you from boating, but I go boating myself, it's not obvious that I have a good justification for my voting.
but going back to your response to Muhannad, if you think of it as a package, I put in and I do
Yeah.
offset. I didn't decrease the risk. So here it's a package. It's not me going
Yeah.
boating. It's me going boating and
That's
making sure
right.
that
So
someone else doesn't do boating. So my overall is
that's
I'm,
right. But that's a case where it's not true that the level of toxicity is going up. Because if I'm
Okay.
boating and actually just extracting an equivalent amount, it stays
Okay.
the same. Whereas if I'm counterfactually not making a difference to these people because I'm preventing you from doing something and I'm doing it, it's still the case that these people are facing an increased risk and I'm the one who's actually imposing it. So I
Okay.
only raised that example of the prevention case because you raised the solar panels as an example of, well, if you're using the fuel stations to create solar panels and those solar panels are being used by people instead of using other stuff, should you be able to claim as offsets the amount of emissions that you prevent by selling the solar panels? And I was resisting that way
Okay.
of counting. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why I use that example.
Okay. Thanks. Any other questions? Yes, I have a question from Sarah. Sarah, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the
Hi.
talk, professors. And I was just wondering, linking what the points raised with something I read recently, and that is, if we use this energy and this gases or whatever to produce things that would accelerate the decarbonization agenda or whatever you can call it, eventually down the line, like in 10 years, we won't be using such emissions or emitting such gases or whatever to repair them. This step, now the transition phase requires this type of energy and consumption, but down the line this won't be the case. So it's like a long-term plan if I got it right. So in this case, does that make the ethical question a bit more, I think, softer or no, lenient towards
Yeah.
these?
Okay. So yeah, so one way of putting what you're saying is, it may be that nowadays there are lots of challenges to organizing, given the way in which the economy is set up and the sources of energy supply that we now have available, it's extremely difficult to structure, the life of a country or its economic
Yeah.
organization or your life as a person in such a way that means that you'll actually be living in a carbon neutral way. And if it's very difficult, well, then maybe we don't really blame people for not meeting that goal. That's the way I'm sort of interpreting the question. And I think there's something that's probably true. So it may be that this is about, we may have good justification for not actually being carbon neutral. And I just want to separate that question from the question of whether or not we can credibly claim to be net carbon neutral. So it may be that once you do the kind of value chain accounting that I'm proposing, it's very difficult for anybody to actually achieve net zero. And if that's true, then that's okay. It may mean that there's nothing particularly blameworthy about an agent who doesn't achieve net zero. But at least we'll have a genuine, clear picture of whether or not people are net zero. So I want to separate the question about whether or not someone is leading a carbon neutral life from the question of whether or not it's really morally problematic that they're leading a non-carbon neutral life. I think with respect to a lot of people, just to give you another example, imagine in my little simple boating example that I was giving with Bashar, that I'm a poor person and the only way I can feed my family is by taking my old boat out on the lake. Now, it's true that taking my boat out on the lake increases toxins, which imposes risk on some downstream people. But we might say that's a case where I'm not living a toxin neutral life, but I'm acting justifiably, because how else am I going to feed my family? So yeah, so as far as, ideally, hopefully it will become less and less true that it's extremely costly to become carbon neutral, even on this broader notion of accounting that I'm proposing.
Yeah. One more thought, since this is linked to the project of ethics, responsibility of consumers, would this model become more complicated to apply it to individuals or to companies, especially to individuals? They want to be zero. How they're going to do the chain thing now becomes almost nightmarish. So
Well,
is that? Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'm mistaken about that. Yeah. But is that going to be more complicated so that they rely on the country taking care of the?
Yeah. So actually, I mean, you can get lots of information if you want to about carbon that's sort of embedded in various different sorts of products. So if you really were trying to do that, I mean, there are these sort of, carbon trackers, which, I mean, it's sort of the methodology underlying them is not always publicly available, so you're not exactly clear what they're doing, but that do talk about the carbon content of various types of activities and things that you might consume. That, for example, track food miles. That is the amount of carbon that is likely to have been burned in bringing a certain type of product to your table. So, and we could, in principle, this sort of information could be gathered and spread more widely, and it could be very easy. You could have apps which are sort of good carbon tracker apps. And again, this would have to be averaging. But you could have information about whether or not the, New Zealand bananas and the Nicaraguan bananas had higher carbon content.
Yeah,
but I'm not in favor of, I think it's not ideal ever that you burden individuals with all these requirements for them to be engaging in these sorts of projects. So I take it this is like obviously second best. It's obviously non-ideal. Obviously, the best thing to do would be to unburden individuals and for it to be just handled as part of the background functioning of your economy. But then there's the question of if it's not happening in the background, does that mean that we can just ignore it, or do we in some way try to orient ourselves in a way that's pointing in the right direction of achieving these targets? I guess that's the interesting question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, wouldn't that, if I want to pay my share and leave the producers to pay something for the offset, I don't want to incorporate all the carbon content of what I'm consuming. That becomes more difficult. Or is it the same thing as the problem with the country? How do I calculate individually my share of that carbon?
Yeah.
Would it be possible if what I'm buying is a product that's very like luxury oriented product, that I have to pay more? Because if I'm buying a product that is less rated to it's more of a necessity or more
Well,
reasonable.
yeah. So
Would that matter for my calculation of my contribution?
well, some people think, yeah, I mean, certainly some people think that they distinguish between like subsistence emissions and luxury emissions. And they think that you, first of all, if we're thinking about what are we morally required to do in terms of reducing our emissions, they typically think we have fairly stringent requirements to reduce certain luxury emissions, but not subsistence emissions. So some people do that. Right? But you're asking the further question about are we more, or is our obligation to offset our luxury items more stringent than to offset non-luxury items? That seems plausible enough to me. That's not an answer. That's not a question I've been trying to answer here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's fair. Yeah, I was trying to link it to your
Yeah.
other interest.
Well, yeah, these are things to, I think there's all these are there are lots of interesting principles that people appeal to in trying to allocate burdens for achieving these targets. And I don't think I have anything particularly useful to add at this point to those discussions.
Okay. Yeah, there's one question from go ahead. Yeah, it's from somebody in the room with me. So yeah.
Hi, how are you? I just
Good.
wanted to say for the talk, and I had a question concerning the accounting, a different question from what you guys have been talking about right now. What do you think about, like on a country level, the countries that have their nationally determined contributions and make these yearly GHG inventories accounting? What do you think in like from a philosophical standpoint, and all the analysis that you guys have been doing now, what do you think about the argument when people try to differentiate the sectors? Because I think one criticism might be to the argument is that we should distinguish the sectors. We can't say, for example, China is taking coal from Australia, but is using that for industry, which is to produce solar panels, and then that is being sent to New Zealand for the electricity sector. So I think one big issue is I guess they do this so they could simplify it. Is they separate the sectors. They try to make, okay, so you have a target for the energy sector, and you have a target for the agriculture sector, and in the case of like the bananas that we were talking about. So I was wondering, what do you think about this idea of like, okay, allocating costs through this value chain that you were talking about in the context of the sectors themselves? Like, how can we look at it in terms of sectors, just so we could like simplify it?
Yeah, so I guess I guess, yeah, the proposal doesn't give any independent significance to sectors. It's simply focused on sort of the quantity of emissions counted in what we take to be the relevant way. So the thought is that whether or not an emission gets into an actor's inventory shouldn't be determined by what sector it belongs to, but merely upon whether or not that country has the right kind of contributory relationship to the emissions. So whether it involve, the sale of bananas or drills or fossil fuels or whatever, that doesn't sort of affect whether or not it ends up on your ledger, and it doesn't affect whether or not it contributes to the sort of the debit side of your net zero ledger. All that matters is sort of its magnitude. Now, of course, like the emissions associated with different sectors may be of different magnitudes, but there's nothing in the proposal as such which gives any independent weight to the sector that something belongs to. But it's probably true that there will be, this can be quite relevant when you're thinking about like companies, like certain companies will find it, given what they're doing, extraordinarily difficult to be net zero in ways that others will find it easier. So, and you actually can sort of see that reflected in the way in which companies have made these commitments. So some companies have actually maybe not gone quite as far as we are proposing, but go some way in that direction, in that they actually, when they're thinking about what their company's emissions are, they actually do go upstream and downstream a fair bit. And typically the companies that do that are companies which don't have a ton of emissions, right? So Silicon Valley companies tend to be a little bit more ambitious than so-called carbon majors, big companies which are actually involved in the extraction and sale of fossil fuels, for example. And it may be that, given that, it makes sense that different sectors have different targets that are, if we're thinking about company targets, that are more suited to their capabilities. It may be almost impossible for a country that is actually exporting fuel to be operating in a net zero way. And if we think that, yeah, look, I mean, maybe it's regrettable, but we still do want some people to be able to purchase fuel, then it may be that the goal for that sector, the sensible goal for that sector, is rather different than another sector where it's easier to make these adjustments. I hope that helps a bit with your question.
Yeah, I think no other questions, and I think it's almost midnight, or not midnight, almost too late for you, I guess. Christian, thanks a lot for this thought-provoking talk, and would like to see you in person at some point here.
Thanks so much for the invitation and all the interesting questions.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
If you come here, we'll offset your gas emissions on the trip.
Oh, I'll do that. I'll do that. Already, I got to do that now.
Yeah, we'll offer that. Thanks a lot, and thanks everybody for being here and for your questions, and hopefully see you soon in another talk. Okay. Take care. Bye.